And then turning to Clive. Clive, you mentioned the hashtag Roots Not Iron, and I Blake Vance, who many of you know was the chairman of Nuffield Canada, and he created that hashtag. He's a well-known speaker. But this week he tweeted a photo of a cereal rye crop grown with a hairy vetch companion, looking really healthy, very, very good indeed. And he put no other fertiliser or plant protection products on there at all. So would you, Clive, say that no-till is a destination, or is it part of a wider journey towards minimal or even zero additional inputs?
Yeah, it definitely is. It's one of those things, it's the classic rabbit hole. The further you stare down it, the deeper it seems to get, and the more complicated and the more possibilities there seems to be. I mean, we grow companion crops within our rotation, like Tom mentioned earlier, the Piola, which is a spring oilseed rape and pea mix. The idea behind that being that the peas they're a great crop on our land, but they can be a bit of a harvest nightmare if they'll go flat. So the role of the spring rape is to act like garden canes and support the structure of the peas, which makes for easy harvesting. And the peas, in exchange, provide some nitrogen to grow a bit of a bonus tonnage of spring grape. So the overall kind of gross yield output from that land becomes kind of 20%, 50 to 20% more than if we're just growing like a single monoculture. It's also creating that diversity for soil biology, so helps the soil improve better rather than having that kind of monoculture. And there's lots of others, there's spring oats and beans and lots of examples of companion crops that create that diversity. It's also good risk mitigation. You know, one of those crops may fail, but you're still left with the other. So it kind of you get two bites of the apple there. But yeah, you're right. There's definitely the possibilities as you get deeper into it and grow confidence of the system. It does make the whole business of arable farming a lot more interesting. I don't think I realised it 15 years ago, but I think I was actually a little bit bored of the way we're farming as well. And I can kind of see that now, and it's made the whole job a lot more exciting over the last 10 or 15 years, even if some of that excitement involves the occasional failure. If you never fail, you're probably not trying hard enough.
Yeah.
Great, thank you, Clive. I'm sure we're all bursting with questions. If you put your hand up, we'll try and get a microphone to you. Yes, there's a question here, Tom. On the second row, just along.
Thank you. Very glad that Clive mentioned slugs. I always have to ask a question about slugs. We've been sort of trying to no-till for around about 4 years in various stumbling blocks that we've faced along the way. One of which is dealing with slugs, particularly in the wheat after oilseed rape. So much so that we're sometimes spending the amount of money that we've saved by not cultivating on slug pellets. What am I doing wrong? Is it something that will get better within time? Is it that I'm sort of probably should have sold all my cultivation equipment to avoid having to cultivate slugs away, and they will get better in time? Or is there any special magic bullet that we can consider?
Good question.
To all of you.
Yeah, okay. No, there is no silver bullet to anything. If only farming was that simple and we could all go and buy a silver bullet. I'm sure there's plenty of drill manufacturers that might tell you that there is one. Rotation, that diversity is the key bit. I mean, I don't think there's anything different about managing slugs, particularly in a no-till or conservation agriculture system, than there is to in any farming system. We all know, conventionally, that the more we grow rape, the bigger slug problems we have, because it's a crop that obviously favours that species. We should have slugs in our fields. We should have a bit of everything. We only get problems when one particular species dominates, and that comes through lack of diversity. So if you grew rape 1 in 20 years, to be extreme about it, you probably wouldn't have much of a slug problem. When we start trying to grow it 1 in 3, or in some cases almost every other year, they're going to become a big problem. Now, history may dictate that we've built up those problems, so yeah, it takes time to get away from that. Even if you change your rotation to something wider and get that diversity now, it might take a few years for that to cycle through a system. But for me, the basics of good consolidation, I find that consolidation is number one thing to kind of deal with slugs, and that was the same when we were cultivating. But it's easier to consolidate in a no-till situation because we're not unconsolidating. That air-soil ratio of the soil is correct from the start because we've not messed it up through a heavy tillage kind of operation. I've personally found that ferric phosphate I've been using for kind of over the last 10 years rather than metaldehyde. there's a bit of conjecture about this, but there is some evidence about there that it's less harmful to some of the beneficials. And then that whole integrated pest management, we've not used insecticides now for 7 years, so we're not damaging a lot of the species that are predating those slugs. So the spiders and the other beetles that are all part of that big picture. So understanding that when we do use some of the things to solve one problem, like say flea beetle problem in rape, what we're actually doing is killing a lot of beetles that are also predating our slugs. So it's rotation, design, consolidation, and IPM for me. And through those three things, I'm quite honest, I'm using less slug pellets historically than we ever have done. I am still using slug pellets, but not in vast quantities.
Yeah, well, we had terrible slugs the first year we stopped cultivating, but they have improved in that time. And I think it does help if you're not using insecticides, because I'd echo what Clive said. you want something to eat the slugs. You want a bit of everything.
Next question. Yeah.
Thank you. Rush, you mentioned earlier regarding P&K, you've reduced your levels of input, not put in on the last few years. At what point does that start to happen on your farm?
I think it's a degree of sort of a bit of trusting yourself as well, really, and looking as you go through them. I certainly found after probably about sort of 3 to 4 years that demand for P wasn't there quite so much. Now, traditionally heavy clay would expect to be putting on a lot of phosphate, and I think as the soil improves and it starts getting better, it seems to be able to be better at mining what resources you've got within there. So I think having cover crops in helps. When you start having things like buckwheat and stuff like that, and that will scavenge for a bit of peat. But certainly, if I look at where we've, sometimes you've got a response to fresh pea in the spring, but it's not massive from what we have seen in some areas. But certainly within about 3 to 4 years, we're starting to see actually that we're not needing to put that phosphate on. I still like to put it on to get Aussie rape established, for example. That's a little bit of a no-brainer for me in our situation, but certainly in that period, it certainly starts to change a bit.
Have either of the two of you reduced your inputs as a result of your no-till system? We don't apply P&K routinely to anything. We still use precision agriculture, so our farm is zoned, and where we have deficiencies, we'll correct. We're correcting problems, particularly on new land that we take on quite often. There's often comes with problems that need correction. I think one thing you have to be a little bit aware of is where your P&K is sometimes. When you're growing cover crops, although maybe you have a soil that tests as good indices for P&K, if that cover crop has pulled, say, a lot of that potash out of the ground and it's now sitting on top, it may not be available for the bean crop or the wheat crop that's following. So we occasionally we are using foliar K, for instance, on our wheats, where we've tissue tested and found that there's the need and demand. It also helps with the water on our lighter soils. So yeah, it's definitely true that access to mineral nutrition rather than the soluble nutrition that we're also familiar with from our soil test results, as soon as you start to get some biology functioning in the soil, you get access to that fairly quickly, I think, because there's no evidence over the last 10 years or so from our fairly comprehensive routine soil zone testing that we are mining or depleting soil indices at all, despite no kind of bagged inputs.
Yeah, I'd echo that. We don't put any TSP on anymore, but which we used to have to regularly do because we were told to by the fertiliser industry, and we've seen no drop in yield corresponding to that. So I think gradual reduction is the answer to that.
Yes, guys. Madam, second round. I think the gentleman in front of you has then got a question after you. So, do you want to start, ladies first?
Thank you. It's probably a silly question, but we've not been here before. You were saying about companion crops, but how do you actually harvest one or the other? What do? You said oats or peas and rape or whatever. I just couldn't work at the end of that?
Yeah, so they're harvested together. So they grow together, and you harvest them together, and you end up with a big mess in a grain trailer. And then you put when I first came across this, it was a farmer in France that I visited, and he had livestock. So for him, getting rape and peas together, for instance, wasn't a problem. He put them all in his mill and fed them straight to cattle like that, because they'd be mixed up anyway. I visited another farmer in France who he'd bought €100 auger from a farm sale, cut the bottom out of it in his farm workshop and welded in a piece of like mesh into the bottom. So the peas went to the end, the rape fell through. We have a slightly, because obviously it's a slightly larger operation that we're running, we have like a rotary cleaner that we use pre our grain dryer, and we can separate crops, and we also use it for cleaning our own seed, because the majority of our seed is farm saved as well. So yeah, you sort it out basically after the field. But the principle is, I mean, most gardeners know that if you grow sweet peas with your runner beans, for instance, it helps with it, and there's definitely this kind of symbiotic relationship between plants. Monocultures are not a naturally occurring thing in nature. So what we try to do as farmers by growing monocultures is actually goes quite against what nature wants to do all the time.
Thank you.
And Clive, I know when I first heard you speak, you were talking about just this subject, and I couldn't quite understand how the two crops came to harvest at the same time. But it was very interesting. You were talking about how they tend to kind of naturally senesce together, so that it's not quite such an issue as you'd imagine.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, you have to be a bit careful, try and be clever with varieties as well. So, for instance, you take like kind of a late maturing pea and an early maturing kind of spring rape variety, for instance. So varieties can help a lot there. But as Tom says, what we found is it tends to change because the crops tend to senesce together, and we've been able to kind of use glyphosate and Optil recently, Diquat, to kind of bring those harvests together. Obviously Diquat's no longer an option, but sometimes some chemical help to bring those things together can also solve that problem. But it's surprising how they kind of almost come in sync together a bit more.
Thanks, Clive. Sir.
Hello, we've been direct drilling for nearly 20 years. You mentioned slugs. Actually, snails are another problem if you're on limestone land. But getting away from that, my biggest worry is what happens when we lose Roundup, because that, I think, will totally take us off. What's the answer?
I think that's a worry for whether you're a no-till farmer or a conventional arable farmer. It's a big question. Yeah, it's a huge worry for us, because fundamentally the base of our system is still reliant on glyphosate, be it for cover crop obstruction or for blackgrass control. As Clive's alluded to, we've got to start to try and sort of look at things a bit differently. But the picture does look a little bit hazy. I mean, you get new fungicides come out, but there's nothing as a total herbicide that's anywhere near on the horizon, if we're lucky. So, we're not far away again from this review coming up again. Which way it will go will be a concern, but I mean it would have a huge impact for us, there's no doubt. There is some interesting bits if you look at what some people do in the organic sector and some in the arable sector. I mean, you probably heard John Palsy speak. It might be something that we might have to take on board, but it certainly wouldn't be easy in a lot of situations.
Yeah, it comes to the same thing. I mean, first off, let's not be defeatist. We haven't lost it yet, but it would be a problem for all conventional, non-organic arable farmers. There's no doubt about that. So there are ways to farm without it. Organic no-till is a thing. In America, there are farmers who are farming organically under a no-till system, although what they call it is strategic tillage, so they can deal with the annual type weeds quite easily using cover crops and destroying them with things like rolling and relying on weather to do things for them. But they will, the grass weeds become a problem over, say, a 3 or 4 year period. They'll build up and they will have what they call a strategic tillage year, rotational ploughing basically, to kind of deal with that. But I think as an industry, farmers are really good at adapting to change. If we lose glyphosate, I'm sure we will find ways to cope. Personally, I mean, that may be the trigger. It's never been an ambition of mine to become organic, but frankly, I'm living quite happily without insecticides right now. I think as our soil health increases, we become less and less. The fungicides become less and less important to us. So really, the only group that I'm really kind of would be scared of losing at the moment is herbicides. But if we lost glyphosate, I might as well start thinking maybe about, well, okay, let's grow smaller crops with a premium. I've got an idea for an experiment we're doing this year where we're going to look at growing a continuous spring milling wheat crop sown into a permanent understory of clover, and then looking at inter-row mowing rather than inter-row hoeing of the clover to suppress weeds. Who knows? But we'll all be in this. If it happens, we'll all be in the same boat, and we'll have to find solutions.
Thank you. Good question. We've probably got time for a couple more questions. If yes, madam.
Yeah, I'd just like to ask a question about what you guys feel are the relative merits of just grazing a cover crop as against, holistic or, planned grazing / mob grazing, in terms of actually terminating the cover crops.
Is that a question about the difference between extensive grazing and mob grazing, or the difference between no grazing and grazing?
Sorry, between extensive grazing and mob grazing.
Okay, well, Humphry, do you want to...
Well, I think mob grazing is, particularly in the winter, which is when you're normally destroying a cover crop, is better because you're going to be able to move your livestock away from the potential damage. So you keep moving them. What we do is we mob graze them on the cover crop, and then at the end we'll let them just go back over the whole lot if it's dry, or at the end of the season we'll do that. So, but it's definitely a good idea to keep them moving. And in terms of compared to destruction by chemicals or mechanicals, it's much more natural. You're adding a dimension of biology by having the livestock in there, which you wouldn't get with the glyphosate. Although we actually do spray glyphosate at the end because there's always some black grass or brome, which is for us it's the only way we can control it.
I'm speaking personally, we have a tame local shepherd who comes in to do a bit of fly grazing on our cover crops, and this year we put in a spring pea, a spring linseed and a winter oat mix, and we grazed that in a mob grazing fashion. We didn't have a back fence to start with, so we did let them go back over what they'd grazed already, but we found that made the sheep really graze all the fodder as opposed to just selectively grazing. I think they would have probably avoided the peas, and they certainly did to start with, until we put the back fence in and really made them graze all our crop off.
Yeah, the livestock's not really my subject, but we have overwintered sheep between kind of November and March, because we are growing a cash combinable crop every year on every acre. So for us, really, it's an American term, enterprise stacking, where it was a case of utilising resources that we have, which is lots of acres of diverse cover crop feed and arable staff with nothing else to do through those winter months, to bring an extra income source, covers the cost of the cover crop seed, brings extra biology to the land. We still use glyphosate even after that ground has been grazed though, and really, as Humphry said and Russ has mentioned it, it's the grass weed that really, those perennial kind of grass weeds that really, that without tillage or chemical destruction would become a problem over time. So that's why we can't rely purely on livestock to do that job for us.
Yeah, I mean, very much. The ideal scenario is about the ultimate mixed system would be able to be integrating livestock and arable. It's probably the hardest bit to get to, I would say, possibly, certainly for probably in my situation. But that would be the ultimate scenario where you could have sort of these sort of various swards and whatever, and then you just rotate your livestock around your arable system. Humphry's getting pretty close to what he's doing. But for us at the moment, it's the short-term cover crops. I would say they're the best sheep because they're someone else's, the ones we have on farm. So we have someone similar to Tom who comes in, they graze them for us, and as he highlights, it's quite interesting to see what they'll pick out. I've had cattle graze some cover crops. It wasn't intentional. They sort of broke through a grass fence. So again, as I alluded to earlier on, sometimes your unintended experiments are the best ones. But that would be brilliant if I could get cattle in there. That I think that the problem for us is it's okay when it's dry. When it starts turning wet, the hooves are a bit too heavy on top of that ground. But they would have done a good job, and it's quite interesting to see what they will pick out. They'll go for anything grass-based first, and they'll leave stuff like radish or mustard till the very last. If there's nothing else left to eat, they'll have a go at it. But they'll take any cereals or those first, be it cattle or sheep.
though he wasn't specifically talking about no-till, Patrick Holden, who's the chief exec of the Sustainable Food Trust, spoke at the East of England Farming Conference last year, and he said the biggest, the best way to ensure that we're more sustainable, what would have the biggest impact in the UK would be the reintroduction of livestock, specifically beef and lamb, into the big arable farms of East Anglia. And that was really interesting that that's what he came up with from a sustainability perspective. And we've probably got time for one more question. Yes, that's a very quick hand there.
Yeah, this is probably a question for Clive, maybe, because contract farming's at the core of his business. I just wanted to know sort of how you sold yourself, how you've been selling yourself to sort of landowners and agents, and managed to persuade them that conservation agriculture and your sort of method of what you're doing is the best route forward.
Right, okay, so I don't really try and sell myself, I kind of wait for them to come to me. I find that helps with negotiation quite a lot, really, if it's that way around. And also, I don't tend to do much via agents. They're a little bit behind the curve on this. They don't really understand or see the benefits. What I found is generally, non-farmers get this instantly, far better than farmers. As farmers, we've all got our kind of preconceptions and ideas of how things should be and why we do things and why we have to do things, and that's how they've always been. When you talk to a non-farmer, and in my area, that is a lot of the landowners. You know, they are people that perhaps made their money in other areas, bought themselves a nice big fancy estate with a nice big house or whatever, and anybody in that position, I mean, 1,000 acres around by me is 10 or 15 million pounds worth. Now, if you're in that fortunate situation, surely your priority is to make sure that your 10 or 15 million pound asset is always going to be worth 10 or 15 million pounds, or hopefully more. What you don't want is somebody mining that land, or somebody kind of, whether that be, that mineral nutrition that land agents get so focused on, or whether it's the organic matter, which no one really bothers measuring a lot of the time. So it's not normally a hard sell to them. They normally get it from a conservation point of view, they get it from a sustainability point of view, and they get the fact that their priority is the value of their asset and not, one contractor being £5 an acre more or less than another. But also, I can demonstrate quite clearly that I can save them a lot of money. Not necessarily in my charges or my fees, but we use a lot less inputs. So they're buying less bags and bottles, and they like that. We took on a new 1,000-acre estate, ring-fence estate, last autumn, so it's year one on there, and I had a meeting with a landowner of that a couple of weeks ago, and they were £107,000 better position today than they were this time last year under a conventional system. So, and they talk to each other. One owner of one estate talks to the owner of the next, and you get a domino effect. So, I've tended to avoid agents, and that takes another layer of cost out as well.
Fantastic. I think that's probably all the time we have left for questions, but I know our speakers are really happy to stay around afterwards and have further conversations. I wonder if you join me in thanking our speakers today, Humphrey, Clive and Russ. And thank you also to Agricology for hosting this discussion tent, and thank you all for listening. Thank you for your attention and your questions. Hope you enjoy the rest of Groundswell 2019.